Human Ecology. He's faculty associate at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy and a faculty affiliate of the Institute for Population Research. We also have Dr. Autumn Berea, who is an assistant professor in human development and family science within the Human Sciences Department. And the two of them are going to be speaking to us about working with diverse populations, community-based and qualitative approaches. Please welcome Dr. Berea. Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's really a really fun event that you all put on and exciting today. We have half an hour. We put together a pretty short presentation, just a few concepts, some examples of some of the different things that we've done, but really hoping to have a lot of time for questions, for discussion. You can feel free to ask questions while we're talking too, if something pops up, but we'll also have plenty of time at the end for more discussion. We're both in the HDFS department. My degree is actually in developmental psychology, so it's always fun to come over. Literally, we're in Campbell Hall, like right over there. You can see my building, so it's fun to be over here. And just talk a little bit about some of the community-based perspectives that we think about in some of our work. So really quickly, I think everyone here probably understands the importance of studying diverse populations, and there's lots of different reasons why. We know that we need to think about capturing the full range of human experience in our populations, thinking generally, but there's also some other more specific times where we really want to think about our populations that we're studying and the samples that we're using. So I, as a developmentalist, I'm always thinking about context and the way in which context is shaping behavior, development, cognition. And that can be, like the narrow family context, but it also could be the context of structural racism. And so thinking about making sure that we are capturing the samples and the population that we need to understand the context that we're studying. And then one of the things about most researchers that end up in HDFS programs is that they're really interested in applied research and thinking about prevention and intervention. And obviously making sure that you're studying the populations that you're also trying to develop interventions for is really important. But we also know that there's a lot of challenges with studying diverse populations. So one of the ones that gets talked about most often is recruitment. How do we make connections with the populations we're interested in studying? These challenges stem from a lot of reasons, including historical legacies of mistreatment, both from the research world, from medical communities, from other institutions. There can be high levels of mistrust. There's structural barriers. It can be harder for I do a lot of work on children and families who experience poverty. They don't have the time, access, or transportation to participate in the studies. And then there's also political and cultural fears. So working with populations who are undocumented, they have reasons to not want to fill out your surveys, answer forms. Working with people from gender and sexual minorities feel like it could put them open to experiencing stigma, things like that. So there's lots of reasons why different populations might be hesitant about working with us. And then if we are able to successfully recruit, we have to think about how are we doing research that is both respectful to the communities that we're studying, but also going to lead to meaningful research. And so thinking about making sure we're doing no harm. So if we're asking questions about discrimination or traumatic experiences, making sure we're doing so in a way that's not going to cause more stress on our participants. But also thinking about making sure that the measures that we're choosing are actually appropriate for the populations we're studying and relevant to their lives and going to provide us with the information that we're really seeking. So I'm going to turn it over to Autumn, who's going to walk through an example from her own work of how she's kind of navigated these things to keep this moving.
Hi, I'm Dr. Autumn Bermea. I am not from a developmental science perspective. I'm your HDFS all the way through. And so I love getting to engage with folks from different disciplines. I find that my own work has been the most challenged and grows the most whenever I do. So I also love being here and being in this space. And so what I tried to do, there's a lot more than some of the stuff that I'm going to walk y'all through, but I tried to make it align with some of the most major challenges that we see. And also, I also welcome questions as I talk. And so please feel free to raise your hand if something doesn't make sense, or if something really speaks to you, or if you had a similar experience in conducting your own research. So one of the ways that you can do this is community-based approaches. So there's a specific term, it's community-based participatory research. So you might hear the CBPR, and that's what that stands for. So it involves the community at all stages of the project. It's considered research with a community or research with a population rather than research on that population. And this really goes beyond just saying you want to be inclusive, but it involves getting their perspectives in order to help minimize and potentially even restore some of the harm that we have caused as researchers. This really helps us to address very specific challenges, right? So even in the example about childcare, we have a childcare crisis in our country, right? But that doesn't affect every community in the same way. So when you're able to do the community-based approaches, you're able to say, what interventions do we need regarding childcare in this community, right? And so being in there and having access to those minds and those folks who live the experience as experts is really important. It's not only important from a more social justice perspective, it also improves our research validity. You have more internal validity. You know you're measuring things accurately if you're talking with the folks you're gathering data from. It also allows folks to have some sense of agency back and a sense of ownership in the work that they do. So show of hands, has anybody heard CBPR before? Okay, a couple of folks. I like to gauge sort of the temperature of like what folks have experienced before I go in. So I'm going to be walking folks through a case example from my own research. The research study, so as part of a project I did, my research background looks at intimate partner violence, specifically within the queer community. For all the reasons that Kelly talked about, doing research within the queer community you want to make sure you're very careful. There's a history of pathologization, excuse me, it's late. Or at least for me, it's late. And so you want to make sure you're treading carefully, right? Because up until the 1970s, just saying it's a queer population was saying there's a mental disorder happening, right? And so you want to be very, very careful that you don't redo the same issues and the same problems. And so what we see in the research consistently is that there's a lot of a problem-based or a deficit approach, where we know that folks who work with queer survivors, we know that there's a lot of room for improvement. We know there's kind of the same sort of problems have been identified over and over and over. But I knew from my collaborations with social workers, with counselors, that there are folks who know what they're doing. But we're just not interviewing them. And so the goal with my research and having a strength-based perspective was to specifically go into communities and recruit the folks who are doing the affirmative work, who are at queer or queer allied organizations. And so this was the research question that my overall project sought to ask. So how folks at queer and queer allied organizations experience responsive provision, right? Focusing on that positive. And so I'm going to go through some of the challenges that we talked about in the last portion of this. The first being recruitment. So a lot of you would probably be aware of the identifying organization that goes along with a very specific part of the scientific process, right? You have to identify your sample. So in this case, it's the same. However, because we're not seeking to generalize our study, we're going to engage in purposive sampling. And so that's meeting specific criteria for inclusion. What would, based on, I like interaction, what based on this research question might be some of the inclusion criteria that I want for my study? And you don't have to raise your hand, you can just shout it out. So we want folks who work as practitioners, right? So they have to be in some kind of clinical or organizational setting. They have to, it's implied, have some kind of training working with queer folks. So even if it's not a queer serving organization specifically, they have to be allied for it. And how I determined that was I was like looking through websites. Do they have anti-discrimination notices? Do they have, that was the big one. But basically, do they have stuff talking resources for queer folks, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't just blanket search all organizations. I had a very specific set of criteria. And then becomes, once I have that identified, I don't just like march myself right in and say, hey, I'm doing a study, come talk to me, right? We talked about issues with pathologizing queer folks. And so there's a lot of mistrust, and that becomes amplified when you're working with intimate partner violence survivors, because we stigmatize survivors in our communities. And so whenever you talk to folks working at these organizations, the first thing they're going to ask is why? Why do you want to study this? What are you going to ask? And that's a very valid question. You have, you run the risk of re-traumatizing folks who've experienced violence. You run the risk of re-traumatizing folks who have experienced homophobia and transphobia. And so there's a lot of issues in terms of gaining access. And so when I did this study, I went into a place where I was new. I had physically just recently moved to this location. How do you think, what are some strategies you think I used to gain access to some of these organizations?
Being upfront with your goals.
Yeah, so being upfront with the goals, and I'll come back to that too a little bit, but even first, I had to get my foot in the door. Yeah.
I would offer them something before I ask them for something. So what do you have? Can you offer trainings? Can you offer resources? Can you offer time and expertise or whatever it is that you have that they might want?
Yes, absolutely. And so that is a thing that oftentimes folks do. In this case, I got references from folks who are already in the community and doing that work, who know me, who know I'm trustworthy, who know my research agenda, and who know me, right? And it wasn't the first person I talked to, but it was, I know somebody who knows somebody, and I was able to gain access that way. And in doing that, I did a lot of what you mentioned in terms of being open and honest about who I was and what I was about. So that takes us to the conducting research section of it. And so transparency for me and my personal research philosophy is incredibly important. In a lot of clinical settings, there's the idea of kind of, gosh, I'm blanking on the term, deceit or deception, right, with your participants to make sure your study, they don't know sort of what you're studying. But in my research philosophy, it is actually important to be transparent in my interview process. And this goes beyond what is just your basic consent form, steps that you'll see. This goes way beyond that. I use, and this isn't mandatory, I use a lot of self-disclosure in my work. And this goes to the, as much as a person feels comfortable doing. So if you're not comfortable, you don't need to do it. But for instance, I tend to disclose that working in queer spaces, I self-disclose that I am a queer person. However, working with violence survivors, I also want to make it very clear that I myself am not a survivor of violence. And so people are aware of that when they talk to me and they know my lived experiences. And as part of that, it's also important to ask or to answer, to legitimately answer any questions. And that holds yourself accountable. And oftentimes I pose a question once I get to the end of my interview of what questions do you have for me? Oftentimes the question I get over and over and over is, why do you want to do this research? Especially if I myself am not a survivor, some folks are like, well, this is a very niche community. Like, why are you studying this? And I share my own experiences, of being a queer person and seeing my friends go through it. I also share the story of the time I was the person that my best friend called when he was leaving his male partner who had abused him and things had gotten really out of control. And I share that story, right? And I'm open and there's an exchange of knowledge there. I also, one of the things that's really important is to be open and honest in sharing your materials. I'm going to go to the second, I'm going to start with the second bullet point because it translates into what I've been talking about for you all, is a lot of the folks who I talked to, because I talked to both practitioners and survivors, and they really wanted to see the questions that I was going to ask by their survivors, their clients. They work with those people with their mental health day to day to day. And so they want to know, is this going to do all the work that we've been doing? Are you going to re-traumatize an already traumatized population? It felt really good when they gave me the go-ahead for that, I will say. But it also, I was called out because I asked a question about how different identities shape their experiences. And I gave an example at an organization that served youth experiencing homelessness, and I included homeless as an identity. And I was called out for it. And at first I was so embarrassed. I left and I was like, oh my God, that was such a stupid comment. But then I realized, like, well, I didn't ask that to a person experience it. And I took it off, and it's not just asking the folks, it's also making changes to your project based on what people tell you. So also being open to that change. And also this goes back to the validity. Are they accurate to the community? For instance, if I'm asking a question or questions about, for instance, talking about abusive folks, and I'm constantly using male pronouns for abusers, female pronouns for victims, that is not accurate to the community that I'm serving. And that would be something that needs to be changed, or else I'm not collecting the right data. And so that is also very important. I just shared a lot with y'all. Do y'all have any questions about any of this?
When you were talking about the self-disclosure and that part of the presentation, how do you suggest for people who are not a part of the community and bridging that gap?
Yeah, well, first off, it goes on comfort level. First off, and it's something that if you're a new researcher, you might not want to. And in some cases, it's a matter of saying, like, I'm not a member of this community. This is maybe the reason why I have interest in this could be something. So I shared the story of what I had experienced. I said, I'm not a survivor of violence. My loved ones have been. And so I'll share that. But again, if it's something that goes beyond your comfort level, it's not something that I ever push on folks. It's the strategy that I use. Yeah.
Could you speak to wanting to make changes to materials, but also needing IRB approval every time you make a change to material?
Yeah. So I do primarily qualitative research. And so my, which I should have said up front, so I don't have the same like item for item. So sometimes it's a matter of like knowing, okay, I might need to add a probe here. So it's not officially part. So it might be like, okay, I need to be prepared for X, Y, and Z. Whenever substantial changes come through though, you do have to do an addendum. So you don't have to redo the whole survey, but there are addendums that you do have to put through to get put through IRB approval.
I can speak to it from quantitative
Yeah,
perspective.
please do.
Yeah, it's pain. So my general strategy is, typically there's some sort of stakeholder in the community with that I'm working really closely. They look at my materials before I go in for IRB, so a lot of the changes happen then. But then I usually have to build into my timeline, time for other people to give feedback on them and then go back in and do an addendum. I try to keep it to just like the initial and the addendum, especially with survey work, like, you don't want to be making changes once it's out in the field anyways, so it ends up, but it is something to think about building into your timeline up front because it is, that's the trick. It is hard to sometimes the communities you're working with bring something new to you and you want to be responsive, but we have these university constraints. So it is always something you're navigating.
So in the example that I gave, that was just something I was able to just take out to say like, okay, I'm not gonna talk about homelessness as an identity, right? I could just not ask that question. And so it was a little bit simpler in that case, but absolutely I second building in time, especially so if you are interested in qualitative research, even when things don't need correcting, it is a part of the qualitative process you're continuously revising your interview protocol. So if you're interested in qualitative research, that's just something from the start that you need to be aware of.
Yeah, I'm curious with your CVP perspective and you're about having people review things and make changes. How do you typically make decisions about when is this going to be a sort of, I came up with the initial idea and then I put in materials by you versus having stakeholders involved in the project designing things and creating those materials in the first place? And sort of how do you make those projects, how much stakeholder involvement you want and at what phases of the project?
That is a great question. So with this one, I use community-based methods. It was not a true CBPR study because I have them do input during the process, but in like a true CBPR study, it's going to be from the start. It's going to be, you have your ideas, you take it to community members, you oftentimes build an advisory board who helps you come up with ideas, helps you to identify, it could be identifying measures, but if you're doing qualitative, definitely forming interview guides. And it's going to be every step of the way, including, and I'm not getting into analyses here because that could last us the whole evening. But once you've analyzed your data, it also involves taking your results and your findings back to the community and saying, this is representative of our experiences versus you took a lot of liberties with our experiences and this isn't what we're saying at all. So it's in it like a true CBPR study, it's the entire way through.
So I have a project right now that we're just launching and the initial research questions and ideas came fully in conjunction with the community. And our community partners love the city schools and so it's working with them. Typically what I find is like they initially help shape the ideas and what the important constructs are and things like that from a quantitative perspective. We'll also go back and see like, well, is there any specific measure we can use for this? Is there things like that? And then bring that back to them so that like that research side of it is still kind of on, it's still on us, but it's with their feedback. I think some of the trickiest conversations, or one of the biggest adjustments I had to make when I was starting to do some of this community-based work is, like you have a scale that you know is a really good scale that everyone uses, and your community partners are like, those items, like these three don't work. You're like, okay. And so I've come around to taking them out and listening to their feedback or modifying items. And typically, you do, like you said, your internal validity is solid. You're getting at what matters to them, and that usually shows up in the typical statistical tests that we go back and do on our measures afterwards. But really listening to them and trusting their voice, like we say, it's something that I found to be really important.
And we're not trained to do that. Like even as somebody, a lot of my work in my training, I was in a very social justice minded department and all of that. And it was still something that it took a very long time. I had a supportive advisor, but in like other courses, it was very much like, oh my God, like, so we're not trained necessarily in that. And so it can be really hard, a really big adjustment in our ways of thinking. They're all good questions. Does anybody have other questions?
I think at the beginning you said, I may have misheard you, so tell me if I did, but we're not expecting this necessarily to be generalizable. Can you speak to that in terms of, you know, what the end product is?
Yeah, so because you're focused on a specific community, you don't necessarily, so we know, for instance, so if we say we're going to focus on OSU as a community, right? And our study is on experiences of being a football fan, right? And so we did our study here and we found that like football is life and football's the most important thing and we love it. Would we then apply the same study or our findings to a small liberal arts college with no football team? For instance. That's not a rhetorical question. Would we do that? No, we wouldn't. And so this is when it comes to very specifically defining your population and to say, these are the parameters, and we want stuff that informs this particular population, right? And so it can be other folks with similar experiences. It can speak to that, but it can speak to the nuances of what's going on. But like these larger scales, which provide us a really good idea of breadth to phenomenon, which is incredibly valuable, whereas this provides us a lot more depth in a much more narrow context. Does that answer your question?
I think about it as, there's not, you're not looking for universal generalizability, certainly. And when I think about it, I think about being a specific question about who I think this might generalize to. And so, like laying that out, and like, I think you talked about that. So, like, is it gonna be people in, I think, just in the News Columbus example, like, school districts of similar size and similar demographics to Columbus might be fine, what we find useful, things like that, but just being really, nuanced about who this might be generally. So.
Thanks.
I know it's different than like, again, the ways that we're like trained to think and stuff. So it's a really good question to have.
In some ways, it's not different, right? Like your football example, I would say like, yeah, you could probably generalize that to other Power 6 conferences or whatever. So I think like, in some ways, it's not different in those ways. Like if we would hope you wouldn't overgeneralize your sample. So if I'm a person who studies treatments, so if I have a sample of people who don't have any psychological disorders, or they do have psychological disorders, but they're not going to treatment, presumably I shouldn't generalize that to people in treatment, right? So, but that's different than, like we've got 5 to 12 people who we have really in depth. So again, from the way we're doing research, you might think of it as like a case study. So I might say like this is this person's like depth of their experience. I wouldn't expect that to generalize to any other person necessarily. Like there might be some themes that you find, but I wouldn't necessarily expect like one person's experience with this to speak to another person's experience with this.
So case studies, I know you're talking about a clinical case study. There's also a qualitative method of case studies. But then with this, you are looking for some commonalities as opposed to generalizability. So what are sort of the things that you're seeing frequently among that are common between these participants,
Okay.
for instance? So it's a little bit broader than like a specific case study, but it's not going to be generalizable to everybody. And so with this, with the same discussion of folks with a diagnosable disorder versus not, you would take it potentially a step farther and say, are there unique characteristics of, for instance, queer folks who have this diagnosis versus who don't? And what are the commonalities among this group? Right. And so we might see, I came in on the tail end of a really interesting sounding presentation about discrimination and homophobia. And so we might identify themes across the board about actually this traumatic experience that we're talking about stems from experiences of homophobia within this specific sample, right? So it goes beyond one person, but then it's not going to be generalizable to non-queer people with that disorder or folks without that disorder at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
That's a really good question. Thank you.
Let me touch on, I'm curious, like, starting to do some qualitative work, and as I'm explaining to students and thinking about the value, one of the ways I've tried to think about it, and I'm curious if you agree with this or if I'm totally off base, is when you think of qualitative work, you're getting this depth of experience and these things that resonate, and you don't know if they're generalizable or not. So I sort of think of the qualitative work as hypothesis generation.
Yes.
So that then we can take those ideas that we think really resonate and move them to something that we can do more hypothesis testing.
Yes, and that is one way that we use qualitative research. There's actually like a really big discussion in like the very nerdy qualitative research communities that I've been about that. But yes, so qualitative research can absolutely help with testing and hypothesis testing. There are other folks who say, no, you can do qualitative research for the sake of doing qualitative research, and it has value even outside of the other. I'm in the camp that both. I have used it to help inform other studies. I've actually helped to design some measures for a population-based study, and we borrowed some queer specific items from existing measures, but there was a phenomenon that we're seeing in qualitative research that wasn't even on that measure. And so that item's still in the process of being tested, so I can't tell you if it's any good or not. But we did come up with an item specifically from qualitative work that I had read. So I do find value in it. I also am a primarily qualitative researcher. And so the goal with my own research often is not to to do hypotheses.
Take to the next, to understand this for something.
Yeah, exactly.
Mine is usually not exploratory work. I'm a quantitative researcher primarily, but I do a lot of expensive stuff. The other time I really find qualitative work valuable is for understanding process and making sense of quantitative findings. I've been in a number of projects where really having the qualitative work side by side with the quantitative work just provides a much richer understanding of what's really going on. So way back when I was grad school, I worked on a welfare reform experiment. We were looking at the data tax on families and kids. And we found these really striking gender differences. And nothing on our quantitative data helped us understand them. But there had been a set of families that were kind of qualitative interviews, and we found that basically these moms were really worried about their sons and disproportionately using their additional resources to support their son's development. And that's still, we can't see that for sure, but that's the only piece of evidence that we're really able to understand that wouldn't have come through if we had only done like surveys and assessments with the children and families.
There's also a qualitative method called cognitive interviewing, which is where you take, after you administer a survey, you pick a select group of folks, and you usually pick a few items. You usually don't do the entire survey because that's just a lot of cognitive burden on your participants. But then you say, walk me through, like when you answered this question, walk me through, what were you thinking? How did you understand this term? So like a term that just using the term like intimate partner violence in my research, there's actually a body of research that says folks conceptualize intimate partner violence in different ways. Some folks have an expansive understanding of it. Some folks are like, it's physical violence only. And so to even say like, when you read the term intimate partner violence, like what did that term mean to you? When I asked you about, queer identity, what does that mean to you? Or like, why did you select this particular sexual identity? That's one that's big in the work that I kind of do. And so it can also be, what are some emotional reactions you had to taking this? And so in that way, you're doing something explicitly to inform measurement. Yeah.
Keep that. I don't know if you have another.
Yes.
Oh, no, we're done.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I think I'm waiting. Thank you for your question.
It's 10 minutes. I will remind people I see that we don't have. I'm good to see you.